Um, I know my mom, bless her soul. She actually passed away not too long ago, and I don't think she was all that comfortable. There's a small anecdote in here, about a moment as a young man when we had white flighted yet again, and I had made best friends with a African American guy who was in my school. He was the only African American guy in our school. So it was because we needed to move to an area where there weren't many African Americans, and I was the new kid in school. So I guess outsiders maybe gravitate to each other. I don't know, but there's nothing more than that really. He came to my house one day when I was a kid, and I wrote about it here. It's things you don't forget. My mom turned him away from the door, said I wasn't there. And in fact, I was there, and I could see him being there, and I didn't do anything about it because I didn't. So my family had a pretty deep and very unsettling to me, streak of racism in it. I have no other way to say it. It's just true. Which seemed completely at odds to their whole theory that they had suffered some form of bias and prejudice coming up. I could never. We had some bad arguments, really, some very intense. I said some really very regrettable and ugly things, but very passionate and unfiltered as as a teenager could be, and then later in life, I think they were not wildly happy about some things that I wrote. Yeah, it's a good question. Anybody, Steve? No, I was thinking about it the other day. Van Morrison is coming to play at UT. The older folks here, Van Morrison, big '60s and '70s guy, and he's still very popular today. But he kind of first became popular, and I remember listening to him a lot. I was back in my pseudo hippie days, and I was just thinking of this the other day because I found my old cassette tape. I still have a car that plays cassette tapes. I'm very proud of that fact. And my cassette tape from 1974 or 6 still worked, and I put it in there. It's like, wow, maybe I've got some 8 tracks back here. I could try that too. But it was Van Morrison's covering a Bobby Bland song, which is really the perfect, poignant, bittersweet song. I've already ordered it to be played at Maudlin. Geez, when I croak, it's got to be played. So anybody shows up, please try to remember that. But it's called Ain't Nothing You Can Do, and it's a very bittersweet kind of song, but sort of rollicking in its way. Has sort of that New Orleans upbeat lift to it, kind of a jump blues. But when you really listen to it, it's the lyrics. It's perfect blues in that sense, uplifting, an uplifting, bittersweet song. How can that be? But I worked backwards, just like everybody else. You have your records, and you realize, wait a second. As earnest and as good as this is by this performer, I wonder who sang it first. And no, I moved to Texas, and especially in San Antonio, Jan Reed, a great Texas writer, some of you know him and know his work, just wrote a book about Doug Sahm, great musician from San Antonio who grew up across the street as a kid back in the 40s and 50s from something called the Eastwood Country Club, which was the outpost, I'd say, in the greater south central Texas region. I would include, Austin in this whole mix. It was the outpost for traveling blues musicians of some stripe. B.B. King and Bobby Bland and Albert King, all the greats, the gods, would come to that place. Etta James, to the Eastwood Country Club, and it happened to be across the field, I think about 300 yards away from where this white guy, Doug Sahm, grew up. And it really was like, as I call it, summoning smoke. He heard the music, and it drew him over, and he realized, again, there's another world that people hadn't been telling him about. And I got to San Antonio, and that place was still around, and a lot of the great, really old places, these sort of barns almost in the outskirts of town, were still around. And the posters, they get nailed up to telephone poles. You see them for sale in Antone's record store up in Austin, but I went to a lot of those shows back in the 70s and 80s, particularly in Houston, which is an unbelievably rich and complex legacy of race relations and then music. almost secondarily, but interwoven. So no, I didn't know anything until I got to, again, I still don't know, but I didn't know. Texas is so profoundly important when it comes to music. You know that, and blues music in particular, oh my Lord, so sophisticated in a way. I think structurally, I've heard musicians talk about it, a marriage at some refined level over time, ultimately, of urban sensibilities and rural urgencies and this rural poignancy merging. And again, merging often in places like Houston and Dallas. Dallas gets short shrift. We're pretty self-congratulatory, as well we should be, living in a great part of the state, here San Marcos and Austin, this area. And so a lot of us, a lot of folks in a knee-jerk way diss Dallas and even Houston. But I'm here to tell you, obviously, there's a great, rich, hidden, again, some ways, musical histories in those places. Back in the 90s, a guy I know up in Dallas called me, he's a great amateur musicologist, Chuck Nevin. I wrote about this in the book, who said, "You're not going to believe this. There's a man living in a place called Elmo, E-L-M-O, Texas, who has been basically, apparently he was abducted, 50 years ago by an unidentified flying object and then held up there for a little bit and then brought back to Earth because he's playing music that's in a time capsule. It's just pristine music that has not been heard or played, since the late 40s and early 50s. I said, okay, sure. Did you bunk your head today? And what else happened? And he's an old hippie. I thought maybe he was having some bad flashback. So I went with him to see this gentleman, Henry Qualls, in Elmo, Texas. There's a photograph of him in the book. And everything suddenly dissolved. I felt like I was watching black and white television. In fact, I was on an episode of a black and white television program. It was just, it was like walking through Havana and seeing every car being from the 1950s. Everything was set in the Wayback Machine. The man was living such an elemental life, hunting for his own food, using folk remedies to heal himself and to lubricate his thinking. He was making a very powerful kind of wine that, after a few attempts at that, I wanted no more because I needed to drive home. And then just playing a form of music that, again, dated back to the 40s, 50s. Mance Lipscomb and Frankie Lee Sims, these iconic artists. He had grown up in this isolated way. So I wrote a story, and like you do in disposable mainstream journalism, sometimes you put superlatives on things because you think it's going to sell. And so the editors said, this is the last true Texas blues man who's, quote, been discovered, which is, again, another weird misnomer. That gives that whole sense, again, of the great white liberal anthropologist, parachuting in somewhere and discovering this heretofore, hidden civilization. It's so derogatory and demeaning to frame it that way, but we did. So there, the editors did. I guess they gave us such a long answer. I got to stop it. But the idea is that there are still these things here. I'm convinced that if you go around Texas this is where journalism has not served our state well. Some people have. Some people have tried to do this in some way. And again, I'm not saying I did, but there are so many stories that were just not told. So many stories just not told. I had to write a story for the 50th anniversary of the Pearl Harbor attack. So what did I do? I raised my hand and said, because everybody was going to write a big package for the Dallas Morning News, and I raised my hand and said, I'd like to write about what was going on in African-American Texas at that time. And basically they said, okay, well, good luck with that. And I knew what they meant. There were no stories to be found in the Dallas Morning News, any of the mainstream newspapers, because we didn't even have then a South Dallas bureau. It just wasn't covered. It was ignored, a whole other world. And so gratefully, some, obviously crusading journalists in Texas have had these wonderful African-American newspapers. I went back and found the week of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the lead story in the Dallas Express, the very important, unbelievable to read, scary to read newspaper that, again, covered the black Dallas. The lead story that week in it was about the fact that a man from Dallas, a janitor, he was a high school janitor, had gone to visit some relatives in Pittsburgh, Texas. Kind of in the northeast part of the state. And while there, this is almost sadly redundant, he was accused of being too forward with a white woman in town, was taken off to a prison, to the jail rather, in Pittsburgh, Texas, where later that day, 200 people from town broke in, according to the story in the Dallas Express, broke in, took him away, took him to a doctor's office in town and castrated him. It's the lead story in the Dallas Express in the week of the attack on Pearl Harbor. It was written in first person. It's written by the guy who had experienced this. It was accompanied by some drawings that were really fascinating. I guess they had someone on staff to do drawings, and so I don't know. I'm totally meandering again. These stories, that are hidden. I used to read the Dallas Express all the time to understand the musical history of Texas, because it had wonderful articles about these glorious artists who had come to town and had to stay, as you would guess, in segregated environments and coming in the back doors of restaurants and all that. And a lot of this would be articulated there. But you don't have to go very far, again, to either see those shadows on the missing water fountains or these stories. I actually wound up interviewing some members of that man's family. I kind of dropped the Pearl Harbor story and sought out some of his relatives who he pretty much affirmed the story as he had told it. So, anything else? I meander all over the map. You need a map to follow me, don't you? You should have been issued a map or a GPS. Everybody gets a complimentary GPS and an iPad. I think Steve was going to arrange that. I forgot to mention that. So make sure to pick up the 3G iPad. I think it's not the lesser one. But if you have any other. Is that how? Oh, okay. Delegation. If there's any other questions, if not, thank you very, very much for enduring me. I really, really appreciate it.